Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, the challenges facing President Trump and the U.S. government. Our guest, Sharon Black, member of the People's Power Assembly. Sharon Black, warm welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
Sharon, a BuzzFeed, that is a website, has been publishing in recent days that President Trump was instructing his ex-today personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, to lie to the Congress about his project regarding the Trump Tower in Moscow. What do you think that could be eventually the consequences of that reveal?
Well, I'm not sure what the actual consequences will be, but for us, I represent a lot of workers in Baltimore City whose...
In the outside of Washington.
Yes, outside of Washington, whose focus has been on the shutdown and what the pain that's caused people. So there's been a lot of talk about Trump's connections to Russia, this and that. And a lot of us feel it's just subterfuge for the bigger problems that are facing people in this country. And we don't think it's the real issue necessarily.
So basically you think that it's a distraction in order to go to the real issues that affect most of the population of the U.S.
Yes.
And you're mentioning the shutdown. For an audience and not necessarily lives here, we're talking that the President Trump closed the government. We're in the fourth week now. Right. That is affecting officially 800,000 federal workers, but there are calculations that with different people also indirectly affected could go to up to 4 to 5 million people.
Absolutely.
Why that happened? First of all, why he has decided that, and then I would like you to talk about the consequences.
Right. Well, well, let me say why this is all taking place. I mean, a lot of it is a campaign to really whip up racism and hysteria against migrants and refugees that are coming to this country because of actually U.S. policies in those countries. Take Honduras, for example, and the U.S. was behind the coup that took place there. So people are forced to leave these countries. They come to the U.S. And then Trump has been using this really as sort of a cover-up for what I consider big business policies, really that benefit the billionaires and millionaires in this country, really to whip up hysteria that really is unnecessary. There is no emergency at the border, in my opinion. I was down there with a group of people that went there to greet the refugee caravan to say welcome to the U.S. And when I went down there, there is no emergency. The emergency is for the refugees.
There is no invasion? There's no national security at risk?
No.
As he says.
As he says, I do not believe that is true. The emergency right now is for the workers who have lost their jobs and lost their pay, and all the other people that will be impacted. For instance, by next month, people may lose food stamps. There are seniors that may be impacted because of HUD, Housing Urban Development, the money that goes to pay for people's subsidies to their housing. People could lose housing. People are facing the loss of they're foreclosing on people's mortgages. You have tremendous amount of suffering that's taking place, and it's a myth that people are well paid in the federal government. Like the TSA agents, they're barely making a living wage right now, so they're living paycheck to paycheck. People are depending now on food pantries, so there's a lot of suffering.
So let's try to put this in perspective. If you are living in this country and you are exposed just to the mass media, or if you're living overseas and you hear what President Trump says, he says in my 2 years of government, the country is experiencing an economic boom, period. On the other hand, you're mentioning that. And let's mention some figures that came to the surface because of that shutdown. 80%, not only about the federal workers, 80% of the American workers live paycheck to paycheck. 50% of the American workers do not have 1 penny of savings. 25% of the American workers not even makes ends meet, meaning that the money that they get is not enough to reach the end of the month. And President Trump is selling or trying to sell to the American public and to the world that this is going on very well and this is an economic boom. Economic boom for whom?
Right, well, that's the big question. You just laid out the statistics that are the most important, and that is how the vast majority of people in this country are experiencing life. Really, for big business, for the billionaires and the corporate, banks, et cetera, they are doing extremely well. They are booming. But for the average person, no. You take, for instance, Amazon workers. Okay, the wages went up to $15 an hour, but that's not even enough, really, for people to live on. And the conditions there are terrible. And Bezos is the richest man in the world at this point, making literally billions and billions and billions.
$120 billion is its fortune.
It's almost obscene. And really, right now, those workers need a union.
So we're talking inequality.
Right, vast inequality that's not necessarily apparent to the rest of the world because it doesn't get portrayed on CNN.
And because it's not portrayed because of what? Is the media at the service? We were hearing lately, and it was an Australian writer and also a journalist that said, everywhere in the world, the mass media is an appendage of the mainstream establishment. Right. Is that happening in the U.S.?
Absolutely.
And therefore, that is painting the picture of a reality that it doesn't coincide with the real world?
Well, it doesn't coincide with the real world. And when you talk about the big business media, it was they that gave Trump all the coverage in the elections, preceding when he was elected. It's they who are still, for instance, we talked a little bit about Russia. They're making Russia the big problem when that, that's what the Democratic Party's been doing, but really ignoring the bigger problems of inequality of wealth in this country, the racism that's been whipped up, not only against people at the borders, but the increased incidences of racism against people of color right here in this country, the rise of white supremacy. People remember in Pittsburgh where the anti-Semitic action against the synagogue, a lot of that has been fomented, Charlottesville, by the Trump election, a lot of,
white supremacy?
Yeah, kind of raising the bigot level in this country. And so you've got a lot of things going on at the same time, and yet the news media is ignoring a lot of it, and they want to talk a lot about Russia.
So if you're looking at this scenario from outside of the country, and you see that, let's say that, like you remember, Occupy Wall Street, we're talking about 1% and 19%. If you realize that 1% is getting all the booming economy and the profits of the booming economy, 99% are leaving, as you were mentioning. Mm-hmm. Two questions. Why the 99% do not react? And the second question is this a democracy if 1% gets everything and 99% lives in sort of a precarious situation? Is this a democracy? How the 99% is represented to defend its own interest? What is wrong?
Well, I don't believe it's a democracy. But then I don't speak for the billionaires. I think it's a democracy for the billionaires. Because really, for the rest, it's really, how can you put it? I mean, it's even like, for instance, what took place at the so-called government shutdown. It's sort of a soft coup, you could describe it.
Bernie Sanders said that it's an oligarchy.
Right, oligarchy is a good word to use. I do want to say one thing about the government shutdown. We keep using that term because it's what people are used to hearing. But the government hasn't really been shut down. You take the FBI, you take the CIA, you take the military apparatus. I don't think U.S. imperialism's been shut down around the world. You take the big trips that, Trump is making to his palace in Key Largo. That hasn't been shut down. The only thing that's really shut down is really a lockout of workers, and the services that poor and working class people need in this country have been shut down. So government shutdown, it's a little bit of misnomer.
Precisely mentioning that coincides with the speech that the president of the AFL-CIO has pronounced in the past days regarding the shutdown. He said this is
it's a lockout.
A lockout. And he says, once more, the establishment, meaning the politicians, are taking us, he said, the workers as pawns. Mm-hmm. And there's time for us to do something, to react. He said, we are not going to forget. We are not going to forget. He repeats that. Is that the case? Is that the situation here, that the people are being caught in the middle between politics and politicians?
Well, they are in many respects, but there's sort of a tiny bit of a problem with that formulation, in my opinion. If people are just talking about people won't forget during the next round of elections, I think that's a little short-sighted. We need action now.
Like what, for example?
Like, for instance, right now, if people remember when the first wave of protests took place at the airport, if hundreds and thousands of people were to go to the airport and shut the airports down, the business and bank interests that support Trump, they would be pushing real quickly. You'd see an end to this if there was some mass action. Now you look at what's happening in Los Angeles right now, which is very, very interesting, which is really a fight against the billionaires who want to privatize and charter the schools in LA. Buettner, who himself is a millionaire, I believe, and the Walton family, which represents Walmart, that poured money into the school board district, for the elections. They're trying to privatize the second largest school district in the country, and it'll have repercussions around the country, really maybe around the world, in terms of privatizing education. Those workers, and I've been close touch with a lot of people in Los Angeles, have been out in the streets, and they have full community support right now, student support, and they've been doing it every single day. And they're very tight. They're very tight, and if they stick to their demands, it's a precedent, and I think it shows the way how you could change the equation. I know we're planning protests in Baltimore on the 26th, Saturday next week. Really, we're calling for a yellow vest movement. I mean, really, people should look towards France, but it's funny because when you talk about the big business media here, they're not showing a lot of what's going on in France.
So they're not really reporting what's going on in the world?
No, they're not reporting that those workers every weekend are out in the streets. And so it's sort of a question of, we get the one-sided story of just what the Democratic Party is doing with Trump, what's going on at the so-called top. We don't get the full story of what we could do to change this.
Is there a relationship between how they reach that point and the U.S. policies, or if you want, blessings to what's going on there?
I mean, that's the crucial piece that people in this country don't know, that we have more in common with the people that are fleeing Honduras and other parts of the global South. I mean, it's U.S. foreign policy. You take Honduras. It was U.S. imperialism or the U.S. government that was responsible for overthrowing the old government and replacing it with a very repressive government. And people are literally under the gun. They face death in those countries. Poverty has increased so drastically that people flee a country to walk with their little children, from these parts of the world all the way to the U.S. border. It's an incredible march. I can't imagine making it. Can you imagine, even walking 10 miles across Washington, D.C. is a tremendous feat. So people have literally sacrificed everything to flee conditions that the U.S. actually was responsible, U.S. imperialism that is, responsible for producing. And so people then get to the border, and actually it is their legal right to ask for asylum. That is a basic legal right, and the U.S. has been denying it. Trump's been denying it.
And there are experts, if you want, that they observe that the situation is really perverse, and they say, basically, the U.S. through the political policies and the trade policies in Latin America are creating that sort of situation. So basically, they are pushing the people to come to the U.S. because they have no other choice, because of violence or because of economic conditions. And once that they cross a border with no papers, they become, according to that vision, the modern slavery that are exploited at levels that has not been seen. And it's so perverse, and after that they demonize the slaves that they have already created and make people hate the slaves, that they are benefit from the slaves. Is that a crazy interpretation or
And
it's true?
no, that's true. You did a better job than I could ever describe it. That is really literally contradiction about it. And, you know, and then people from, let's say, someplace in Indiana who know nothing about what's actually taking place at the border are convinced that now there's an emergency, and, you know, there's been tremendous amounts of racism that have been whipped up by Trump. And, you know, the people who support him talking about, you know, criminals and drug dealers and et cetera, things that I don't even want to report. They're just so horrendous what they're saying. And people actually, to a certain degree, are believing it. But a lot of people, it's falling on deaf ears, especially when you're in the Southwest. When you go to Los Angeles, we had a group of people who traveled from LA who took up donations, and also from around the Baltimore area. So there's a lot of people in this country who are beginning to see through this. And then we took a caravan to Tijuana to distribute aid to people there and to talk to people and learn firsthand and be able to bring the story back to this country. So it's not, I don't want to paint the picture that everybody's fooled by the Trump rhetoric. But part of it is, as long as you keep up this villainizing people and really this telling of lies constantly, then you can get away from the real problems which we were talking about before, which is the austerity that's taking place in U.S. cities all across the country, meaning the cutbacks, the budget cuts, the layoffs. We were talking about Amazon, the incredible exploitation of workers.
But in the
on
meantime, a
job.
10% increase of the military expenditure.
Yeah, exactly.
And you were mentioning, going back to what you were mentioning the strike of teachers in LA, the second school district of the country. We're talking 6,000 students, 30,000 teachers. And there are some figures that also came out that are pretty disturbing for many people. For example, that that district is the most segregated district in the country. 75% of the people there are Latinos, and 80% of the kids that attend school go to school for a meal, to have the day meal. Talking about the teachers, they request a 5.6% increase of salaries, and they have been offered 5% in 2 years. But the parents of the students are mentioning that the teachers even have to buy some of the school material for the kids. On the other hand, we are talking that 75% of the teachers, they really do not have any type of benefits in their life. Situation is absolutely precarious for the teachers and for the students. Is that another clear sign that poverty is all over the place and there's no money to education, public education, but as you said, they're trying to push charter schools where private money could sort of, for many, contaminate the idea of public school and free school?
Right. Well, charter schools is like doing away with public, well, it's doing away with public education. It's not like doing it. It is doing away with public education. And the conditions that you were talking about, they're not just in LA. I come from Baltimore City. The school system there, there's still lead in the water. A lot of kids can't even drink from the water fountains there. Teachers are forced to, you know, take money out of their pockets to buy supplies for students.
Same thing.
Same thing everywhere. And so, you know, the battle in LA impacts us on the East Coast just as much, because if they can win this, that is the billionaires, then they will privatize these schools. And it's a big bonanza for, literally for business, because it doesn't mean they make profit off of schools. And they've done it in the prison system. And I could go into a whole long thing of what that means and how it impacts individual people, but it is a cut in education. It makes it even worse. For instance, a lot of times it costs more in public school to educate kids because private charter schools can refuse to take in a child who's developmentally disabled, who has a certain learning disability or has a problem. They don't have to do that. So it costs more to educate people who have more difficulties. But charter schools can say, no, we're not accepting you, or we're not providing this particular service to your child.
So going back to the big picture, we have elections in 2020? Let's say that there's an agreement that if you want, the election campaign has already started. According to Noam Chomsky, the intellectual, he said, in the US, there are not two political parties. There's just one political party, the business party.
Right.
So basically, if you're thinking that Democrats could present an option to Donald Trump, according to Noam Chomsky, they are the same thing. It's part of the establishment, and for example, Bernie Sanders is mentioning that everybody, if you want, in the Congress of Washington are being bought by the money of the big interests. So they are not really legislating for the people, for the 99%. They are representing the 1%. Right. Basically, they are, if you want, puppets at the service of the big corporations and not to the people. And you have two parties, or if you want, one party. My question is, why is there any possibility that third parties grow, become an option, that the U.S. population are forced to choose between, some say, the same dog with a different color?
Right. That's a big important question that a lot of people in the progressive movement have been debating in the U.S. for a long time. And I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand that a third party couldn't develop in the United States. Certainly we don't have democracy at all in this country. We have an oligarchy, as you pointed out. There is no democracy. You don't have a real choice. But it hasn't happened yet that a real third party representing workers and poor people in this country has actually been built. Could it be done? Maybe. This country's history usually has been of social explosions. And you've seen this during the early period of the labor movement. You've seen it during the civil rights period. It doesn't mean that, a third party wouldn't develop. I think that people are debating that, trying to figure it out. There's certainly been progressive things that have happened. You look at the Palestinian woman elected in Michigan. That's a very important breakthrough. There's been a number of indigenous women in this country.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Hispanic from Puerto Rican origin.
Right. So there's been some people from below. And it may mean that there might be some kind of schism or break inside of the Democratic Party, maybe. But for those of us who are on the outside of this, our jobs really has been to mobilize and organize people. I mean, we look at the Venezuelan elections. I mean, and here you have a person, President Maduro, who literally was a bus driver, come from the bus drivers union. You would never see that in the U.S. It's far more democratic. That was a democratic election. I recently traveled to Cuba, and the elections there, the thoroughness of how people debate stuff and the fact that money is not interjected into the equation makes their system more democratic. But you don't hear that in the U.S. And I tell you, we have the least democratic system for a country that's not out and out ruled by, some dictator. And we may be going in that direction. Who knows with Trump?
And last question, and please a short answer. Who's the winner of the 2020 election? Who wins the election?
That I cannot answer. I hope the people rise up and the people win.
Sharon Black, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.